Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The current module is entitled The Adivasis in India, Living on the Margins. The objectives of this module are to understand the issue and problem of the Adivasis in India from a legal and political perspective. The author of this module is Umakant, an independent research scholar in New Delhi. I am Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University in Rome. When we talk about the Adivasis, we can also use the officially designated term of the scheduled tribes. The Adivasis, or scheduled tribes, have continued after almost seven decades of independence to live a life of economic, political, cultural, and social imparity or exclusion. So much so that we can regard them, and as sociologists often do, as being condemned even almost 7 decades after their independence to a life on the margins. Now, the condition of the Adivasis is intriguingly one where the larger social sentiment is not necessarily particularly favorable. They continue to be the objects of ridicule and insult and derogatory expression in common parlance, and if even beyond the social fact, the policies of government, including those of liberalization and internationalization of the Indian economy, has continued to put ever more pressure on this extremely vulnerable part of Indian society, this part which is also not quite a part. When we are referring to the Adivasis or the scheduled tribes, there are basically two kinds of geographical conceptual distinctions that are mostly made. For example, by the sociologist T.K. Uman. He described that we can regard one broad group as the insisted central tribes in the central part of India, and the other is, of course, the geographically more distinct frontier tribes of northeastern India. Now, sociologists have made this description, and the Indian government has more or less also followed suit in thinking that we have basically two most broad geographical conceptual types of scheduled tribes or Adivasis, those in the central areas that are insisted, and those in the northeast that are geographically somewhat isolated from, as we refer to it, mainland India. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there have been two ideological patterns corresponding to these two geographical conceptual distinctions. So the attitude for the insisted tribes, the central Adivasis, has always been one where we intend on assimilating them. So pegging their geographical proximity to their religious, let's say, not sameness, but similarity of religious practices and principles. The idea has been to completely assimilate the central scheduled tribes into the mainstream Hindu culture. The attitude for the northeastern, the frontier tribes, has been one of isolation. The idea is, like in the United States, reservations for the Native Americans, these geographically separate semi-autonomous areas. The idea has been a geographically separate isolation of the scheduled tribes, of the frontier communities. So between these two attitudes, one of assimilation in the Hindu mainstream and one of isolation, we found that the social, political, economic, and cultural parity of the dignity, rights, and possibilities for mobility for the scheduled tribes or for the Adivasis has been profoundly impaired over the last 7 decades. This module is going to discuss many of these aspects, the emergence, and of course conclude with the manner by which this problem can begin to be tackled and overcome. The tribal population scattered across the country is differently placed with respect to the existing politico-administrative structures. Where they are a numerical minority, they are part of the general administrative structure, although certain rights have accrued to scheduled tribes across the country through reservations in educational institutions and government employment. However, where they are numerically dominant, 2 distinct administrative arrangements have been provided for them in the Constitution in the form of the 5th and 6th schedules. The 6th schedule areas are those that were excluded until the Government of India Act 1935 in the erstwhile Assam and other tribal dominant areas which became separate states. These areas have been given special provisions under Part 21 of the Constitution. The provisions of the 5th schedule have seen further legal and administrative reinforcement in the form of provisions of Panchayats, extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996. Well, let's look at the demographic profile and the access to amenities and educational profile of the Adivasis. The scheduled tribes constitute 8.6% of India's population according to the 2011 census. The state-wise distribution of the scheduled tribes population is as follows. In MP, 14.7%, Maharashtra, 10%, Odisha, 9%, Rajasthan, almost 9%, Gujarat, Jharkhand, again, both almost 9%, Chhattisgarh, 7.5%, AP and Telangana, almost 6%, West Bengal, 5%, Karnataka, 4%, Assam, 4%, Meghalaya, 2%, and the rest of the states and union territories, 11%. So Punjab, Haryana, Chandigarh, and the Delhi area and Pondicherry don't have any less listed scheduled tribe population. Out of the what are approximately 250 million households in the country, this is all as per the 2011 census, the scheduled tribe constitute 23 million households, out of which 20 million are in rural areas and only 3 million in urban areas. So we get a basic sense of what is going on here. Scheduled tribes, which are a little bit less than 10% of the households, are almost entirely within the rural areas. Very few within the urban areas and none within major cities, Chandigarh or Delhi. The facts depicting the miserable situation of the Adivasis are quite clear also from the very same census where we find out about their geographical distribution. So right around 25% of scheduled tribe households have tap water facilities. So only 1 in 4 of these households. Only 1 in 5 households have access to wells. Just under 40% of these scheduled tribe households have access to hand pumps. 20% of the households, so 1 in 5, have drinking water sources within their premises. Less than half of the households have a drinking water source near the premises. More than a third have access to drinking water away from their premises. About half of the households use electricity, especially for their main source of lighting. The other half uses kerosene. About 1/3 of the households have a bathing facility. So right around half of the scheduled tribe households use electricity as the main source of lighting, while the other half use kerosene. Less than a third of the scheduled caste households have a bathing facility. 14.1%, so less than 15% of the households have enclosure without a roof. Now, well over 2/3 of the households have no bathing facility. Less than 1/4 of the households have a latrine facility. So that means that more than 75% have no latrines. A few of the 3 out of 100 of these households have access to a public latrine. The most disturbing of these figures is, of course, that more than 3/4 of the households have to defecate in the open. Now, this is a very shocking set of facts and statistics when you compare them to the other non-scheduled tribe communities of the mainstream in India. Something very similar happens when you look at the educational profile. These figures come from the Ministry of Tribal Affairs in 2014, and the figures are quite startling. The overall literacy rate among Adivasis in India is less than 60%. So quite a significant amount lower than the mainstream. The completely illiterate is over 47%, literate up to primary, about 25%, and then the facts and figures go on like this, culminating into the very low figure for graduate level education at below 2%. So the urban scheduled tribe communities, which again amount to no more than 3 million of the 23 million, is a little bit of a higher figure, as the completely illiterate is 22%, and those that achieve a graduate education can be as high as 12%. So things stand better with education and literacy in the urban areas, but we'll see that the situation is still far from satisfactory. Diversion of budgetary allocation has to be looked into when we see that we're dealing with statistics as miserable as those as we reported. What exactly is going wrong here? A report in Tehelka in December of 2014 revealed that Adivasis have been deprived of a staggering 500,000 crores, so 5 lakh crores, over a period of 30 years by successive governments, both at the center and the state. Critical look at the latest union budget, 2014-2015, reveals that Arun Jaitley, Union Finance Minister, simply denied rupees 47,260 crores and rupees 25,490 crores to Dalit and Adivasis respectively. The National Coalition for Scheduled Caste Subplan, SCSP, Tribal Subplan, TSP legislation, an umbrella organization of Dalit and Adivasi groups, recently tabulated, using budgetary documents and RTI information, that the funds denied from the 7th to 12th 5-year plans in the union budget come to rupees 5 crore 27,723. So in other words, the amount of the budget that has been distributed has been reduced in the previous 7 to 12 5-year plans by an amount that almost is equal to the budget in any given year. So let's put this differently. The union budget in this period should have allotted more than 8 crores, but the amount allocated was 3 crores. So it's safe to say that more than 60% of the amount due has been denied to the marginalized sections, despite that these are inbuilt into legislation. So the legislation is there to disperse the funds, but the specific government budgets don't earmark those funds, or don't disperse those funds that are earmarked for the scheduled tribes. So what these figures show is that the funds earmarked for the scheduled tribes are simply not dispersed by the specific governments, despite the fact that the funds are legislated, and there are various acts that require this kind of disbursement. Now, in Jharkhand, the plan expenditure details of the government show that crores of TSP funds were diverted to purchase airplanes, a VIP version, one trainer aircraft, and one motor glider. These are allegedly for the infrastructural development of Jharkhand. The flying institutes and the runways and the construction work of court and residential and police buildings were the recipients of the funds that were supposed to go to the scheduled tribes according to the tribal sub-plan. So what we find is that the tribal sub-plan earmarked budget in the case in Jharkhand went primarily to procure airplanes for VIP use and to work on MLA and senior government officers' residences. Now, among the construction of 8 houses for judges, we find the destination of the diverted TSP funds. Now, considering that the TSP funds, or the funds that were supposed to be dispersed to the tribal community to help with the latrine facilities and the education and so on, considering that these funds were diverted to buy airplanes and build houses of judges, it's easy to understand why there is very little recourse for the tribal communities to have these funds dispersed. After all, the senior government, the senior administrative, and the senior judiciary are the recipient of the funds that are meant to go to the tribals. The situation in Madhya Pradesh also shows something interesting for the state budget year of the financial year 2014-2015. So let's turn from Jharkhand to Madhya Pradesh. An analysis of the MP state budget in the financial year 2014-2015 also throws up interesting and glaring diversions of TSP funds. Funds are diverted to huge infrastructural projects, including highways and bridges, the beautification of lakes and ponds, animal injections, building synthetic hockey turfs, raising state industrial protection force, and very significantly, also the money was spent on certain Kumbh Melas, festivals that are notorious for excluding of the scheduled tribes. The funds are also diverted to pay allowances to Gao Sevaks, a pet project of the Sangh Parivar. So we see in MP, just as in Jharkhand, a diversion of the funds that are supposed to be dispersed to the the scheduled tribes in order to increase their literacy rates, to help work on their the development of their housing, electricity, access to water. These instead are being taken by politicians and certain elite within the states for their own uses. Chhattisgarh is no different. The budget breakup for the year 2014-2015 reveals that the TSP were diverted to build capital assets for the special police and the police. So who are the tribals supposed to turn to report this diversion of their funds? In Odisha, corresponding documents for Odisha point out that TSP funds were diverted to schemes like modernization of police and other forces, construction of jails, construction of police barracks, residential buildings for police through Odisha State Police Housing and Welfare Corporation, and special funds for police training. We'll turn to Gujarat. For several years now, Gujarat, which has been hailed as a model state in India, has also been systematically diverting TSP funds. These diversions are mainly channeled into infrastructure projects and major irrigation projects that benefit richer farmers. So the Dalits, who constitute, the main landless population in Gujarat, have their funds also diverted to the landed farmers. The tribals constitute the largest group of displaced people, 76% of the total as per the estimates of the Planning Commission. But the funds that are supposed to be allotted to them have been diverted instead to celebrate, for example, Swami Vivekananda's 150th birthday. An interesting diversion in the context of the several reported cases of brutal violence during such similar celebrations, including Ambedkar Jayanti. So what we see in this section is that the figures about literacy, the educational profile, and the quite disturbing figures that result from the census are occurring at the exact same time as the diversion of the budgetary allocation that is meant to address the sad and sorry figures. But this is not only a socioeconomic issue, there are also purely socio-cultural elements that have to be discussed in relation to the way that the Adivasis are living on the margins and socially excluded. And the point that we have to raise is the figures on the atrocities against Adivasis, which has been a recurrent feature over the last several decades. A total of 11,000, almost 11,500 cases were registered with police stations across the country as cognizable crimes committed against Adivasis, as revealed in the Crime in India Report 2014. According to the report of the National Commission for Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes, that's in the 1990s, and Crime in India, National Crime Record Bureau, Government of India, in the 24 years from 1990 to 2013, a total number of cognizable crimes registered against the Adivasis at police stations across the country was more than 1.25 lakh cases. So what we're talking about in the last 24 years, there has been more than 1.25 lakh cases of cognizable crime, violent crime against Adivasis. From 1990 to 2001, a total of more than 55,000 cases were registered, of which the figures of different crimes were as follows: murder, about 1,200 cases, rape, just under 5,000 cases, kidnapping, more than 500 cases. Then there's, of course, dacoity, robbery, arson, hurt, and others, totaling 55,000 cases. In the recent decade, in the most recent decade, this number has actually increased to 70,597 cases. So murder has increased in the past decade over the decade previous. Rape has almost doubled. Kidnapping has doubled. Dacoity has doubled. Then there are, of course, arson and hurt and robbery and all of these others. So what we're seeing then is that there's a lack of sensitivity and sincerity on the part of government officials about Adivasis. An analysis of 800 complaints received by the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes during the years 2006 to 2009 reveals a pattern which is quite common as far as dealing with Adivasis complaints are concerned. Reports received in the Commission containing information about date of FIR, date of filing of charge sheet, invoking of provisions of Prevention of Atrocities Act, and the FIR charge sheet and payment of monetary relief and so forth, were all scrutinized with a view to analyzing the action that is being taken by the states in implementing the provisions of the Prevention of Atrocity Act. Well, what did this scrutiny show? It was observed that the communications from the Commission were not given priority by the states, as replies within the stipulated period of 30 days were received in far fewer than half of the cases. Despite reminders, replies in 16 cases were received after a period of 1 to 3 months, whereas more than 3 months' time was taken by states in furnishing replies in 22 cases. Replies in 5 cases were abnormally delayed for more than 1 year. From the statement, it was apparent that the provisions of the Prevention of Atrocity Act were invoked in FIRs as well as charge sheets in 59 out of the 75 cases, while in 5 cases these provisions were invoked in the FIR but were not incorporated into the charge sheet. So the Prevention of Atrocity Act was not invoked in 11 cases. This tells us that it's clear that the charge sheets were not being filed on time in the courts, and the other rules about how to file them were not being followed in a majority of the cases of atrocities, which led to delay in providing relief or justice to the aggrieved person. So let's turn from the social then to some of the development issues in the Adivasi area. The high-level committee, on its report submitted in early 2015, is of the view that the appropriation of tribal land and forest that began during colonial rule has continued unabated to the present. Since tribal inhabited regions are rich in mineral, forest, and water resources, large-scale development projects invariably came to be located in tribal areas. No region in India illustrates this better than the states of Jharkhand and Odisha, which have considerable natural resources, but also the highest percentage of tribal people living below the poverty line. In 2004 and 2005, the proportion of tribal people living below poverty stood at more than 50%, almost 55% in Jharkhand, while the number was at its highest at more than 75% in Odisha. Overcoming tribal isolation through large-scale mining, industrial and infrastructure projects, as these states have witnessed, has clearly not resolved the problem of poor development indicators. Rather, these have led to further impoverishment and vulnerability. The report further mentions that over the last 2 decades, there has been a massive push to this development agenda, which has coincided with economic liberalization and the entry of private corporations into tribal areas. This has been met with considerable resistance from tribal communities. But the resistance is interpreted as evidence that these tribes are anti-development, which is of course far from the truth. What the tribes have been questioning is the model of development that is being imposed upon them. Laws and rules that provide protection to tribes are being routinely manipulated and subverted to accommodate corporate interests. So the Panchayat's extension to the Scheduled Areas Act of 1996, the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act of 2006, and other such legislation are designed to regulate governance and political autonomy. They became the lightning rod of intense struggles and deliberations by Adivasi networks across the country. The debates around these acts represent an exercise in popular and even transformative constitutionalism. For Adivasis to enjoy the right to non-discrimination under the Constitution of India, the right to liberty must translate into freedom from internal colonization, a right that was affirmed on paper in 1950, the year the Constitution came into force. Now, Usha Ramanathan in 2015, a legal scholar, has argued that it's no secret that the state and corporations view Adivasis the same way that they view the forests, as hurdles in reaching the resources they need for the growth project. Adivasis, forests, and mineral resources especially are found in exactly the same places. Far too many projects demand the price of destruction of Adivasi life and the diversion of forests for non-forest purposes. So what we've been discussing in this module about the Adivasis is not only the fact of their living on the margins, but also the reasons why. These reasons are constituted both in terms of geographical spread of where they appear, as well as the social causes and prejudices behind what allow a regime of constitutional protection from both protective measures to actually affirmative action policies to get from a situation where the constitutional protections are so strong to a reality where the Adivasis have miserable statistics available to us in the census, available to us in Crime Records Bureau, that in no way correspond to the constitutional protections and the affirmative action that they are supposed to enjoy. So how do we move from what we have on paper to what we see in practice? What the module has focused on is the correlation between the basic diversion of the constitutional intent into private, corrupt, and in some way anti-scheduled tribe practices. So we began by pointing out that the scheduled tribes are geographically distinct in the sense of inhabiting either the central areas, a small portion of which are urban, or the frontier areas of the northeast, primarily rural. Within these two different kinds of communities, there were two different sorts of policies. One was assimilationist and one was isolationist. what we are finding after scrutinizing the census figures and the crime figures is that all of these communities across the board are subject to increasing levels of violence, robbery, atrocity, rape, especially in the last decade. So things are not necessarily getting better for the scheduled tribes as they seem to be getting better for the middle classes, but rather getting somewhat worse. Now, why are things getting worse? The idea is that the internal policies and the external policies are both taking their highest toll on the most vulnerable, in this case the Adivasis. So on the one hand, the funds and budget that is supposed to be apportioned to the uplifting of the tribal people is instead diverted to the infrastructural projects in various states, and this goes from even diverting funds for the construction of houses, for police, for politicians, and for judiciary, to the purchasing of VIP jet planes and so on. And all of this happens at the same moment that the literacy figures for the tribal people fails to improve. The infrastructural facility for the tribals, for example, access to latrine, drinking water, and non-kerosene forms of power, has failed to improve, while the infrastructure for the state serves the interest of the commercial classes or the landed gentry. So we see here the diversion of funds as being one of the crucial elements, but there's another external aspect, which is the liberalization policies. So the liberalization policies that have been in effect for the last 2 decades in the country have of course served to create a boom in the economy, and there's no question about that. But have the Adivasis been the beneficiary of this growth? What we find is that the growth has been largely exclusive and not inclusive growth. So the Adivasis over the last decade have not seen substantial increases in their prosperity, wealth, access to education, access to opportunities that have been growing for the mainstream middle classes. So the internal and the external factors have been leading to a stagnation, and in many cases, in terms like crime, a reduction of the advances that the scheduled tribe have been able to enjoy in an independent India over the last 7 decades. Finally, what we find is that the attitude toward pushing for this kind of growth, economic growth, has been one that takes a heavy toll on the forest dwelling scheduled tribes. It is projected in popular media, and it is common attitude amongst many people involved in industrial development that the tribals stand in the way of growth. The real question is, what sort of growth are we talking about? There's no evidence to suggest that the tribal communities stand in the way of an inclusive growth that takes account of their historical and cultural practices. But those sorts of unsustainable growth models that demand the destruction of the forests as well as the life styles of the tribals are of course opposed by those people, as they would be opposed by any rational community. In the end then, what we find is that for the political and the economic condition of the tribals to improve, the social attitude of the majority, the mainstream, has to improve. So there are plenty of constitutional and legal norms that allow for the uplifting of the tribal communities, but our social prejudices, along with certain greeds and power politics, has prevented the scheduled tribe from enjoying what they were owed by the Constitution in the independent era. Thank you.